Number 1. So a couple of years ago, I was job searching as it was time for me to finally find a job. One day when I was submitting applications online, I received a phone call from my friend Josh. I told him what I was up to at the time, and that's when he asked, "Why don't you just come to work with me?" Josh worked at one of those cheap motels, and I was pretty sure he got paid minimum wage, but a job is a job. I asked him what I would need to get the process started. He told me to just go down to the motel and submit an application. He said that they were looking to hire someone anyway, and if I put him down as a reference, I would probably get the job pretty easily. So I took his advice, and the following day I went down to the motel. It was the first time I'd been there in person, and it really was as dingy as my friend had described. But at rates of $50 per day or $250 per week, you can't really expect any form of luxury. I walked into the motel's office, if you could even call it that. It was essentially just one of those motel rooms with the kind of door that is split in half, so only the top will open if you choose. And instead of a room number, it said office on it, with those plastic stick-on letters. Inside the office, there was a middle-aged man sitting at a desk that consisted of a small plastic fold-out table, littered with paperwork. After asking me how he could help me, I told him that I was Josh's friend and was there to fill out an application. The man seemed pretty enthusiastic about this, and told me that Josh had mentioned I would be stopping by. After about 30 seconds of searching through paperwork, he finally found an application and handed it to me. After about another 30 seconds, he found me a clipboard. The application was very short and simple. It was one of those generic one-sided forms where only the most basic information was being requested. After about 3 minutes of writing and checking boxes, I handed the application back over to the man. He seemed to only take a few seconds to glimpse over what I had written and proceeded to ask me if I had any previous experience doing this type of work. I told him that I hadn't. He asked me about my availability and explained how much and how often I would be getting paid. And that was it. 3 minutes of filling out an application and about a minute or two of interviewing, and he asked me when I could start. I told him I was available to start as soon as he needed me. He definitely seemed happy about this, and went on to tell me that he and his wife would be going out of town soon, and he would need to get me trained before he left. We agreed that I would start training with him the following morning. I thanked him, we shook hands, and I left. I called Josh on my way home to tell him the good news and that I would be starting the next morning. So the following day comes. I was a bit nervous, but not too bad, having met my boss the day before. He was definitely a bit off, but also pretty laid back and made me feel pretty comfortable overall. I found out my first day that my training was going to be a bit expedited, as the owner was leaving in just 3 days for his trip. Overall, it wasn't a very complicated business to run, but it was still a lot to learn in such a short amount of time. Checking guests in and out, completing various forms, processing different types of payments, cleaning the rooms a certain way, how to troubleshoot various issues, etc. After the 3 days of training, I was going to work one shift with my friend Josh, and after that I would be all on my own. The shift with Josh really helped me with my confidence, as everything went smoothly, and there were very few instances where I needed to ask for his help. The next shift I worked, I was on my own. I had to work overnight, as the motel was a 24/7 operation. Josh assured me that this was the easiest shift, and most night shifts consisted of killing time. There might be the occasional person looking for a room in the middle of the night, or the occasional guest having a request, but for the most part, it remained pretty quiet. Although Josh said he'd be asleep in bed throughout most of my shift, he said he'd keep his phone next to him and that I could call him if I ran into a jam. This all gave me enough assurance, and I headed into work that night without any serious worries. The first few hours went by without anything eventful happening. I had one phone call from a girl asking if we had any rooms available. I told her we did, and she said she'd call back in a little bit. Aside from that, I just continued killing time on my phone. At around 2 a.m., I noticed a car pull into the parking lot. A man got out and began looking around. Once he spotted where the office was, he started heading over. Although he looked a bit disheveled, nothing really stood out about him. He stumbled into the office and kind of just started looking around, as if he were confused about where he was at. Hi sir, can I help you with something? I said. He then made eye contact with me at this point and just kind of awkwardly stared at me for several seconds, before finally saying, "A room." I asked him if he just needed a room for himself for the night, and he replied by simply nodding. I gave him a form to fill out and asked him for his ID and credit card, which he complied to. While I was putting his information into our system, I noticed some unusual movement out of my peripheral vision. I looked up at the man and he appeared to be trying to swat at and get away from some type of invisible fly. I did my best to ignore his weird behavior and pretended I didn't notice. I finished the man's registration, thanked him, and gave him his key. He kind of just looked at me for a moment and then walked off. That was pretty weird, I thought. I just kind of shrugged it off and went back to playing around on my phone. A few minutes later, the silence surrounding me was abruptly interrupted. I heard some distant shouting. Although I couldn't make out what the individual was saying, I could tell they were getting closer and closer to where I was at. Before I knew it, the strange man re-emerged into the office. He seemed very agitated and was shouting at me that he couldn't get into his room. He began yelling things like, "I can't get into my room. Why won't you let me into my room?" I was a little intimidated at the man's level of hostility, but calmly and professionally apologized to the man. I assured him it must have been some sort of mistake and that I would give him a different key to get into his room. This seemed to calm him down a bit. He grabbed the key from my hand and stormed out of the office, again being hostile. I was almost certain that I had originally given him the right key, but prayed that I had made a mistake that was now resolved. For the next few minutes, I was still on edge, just waiting for the inevitable to happen, and of course it did. Before I knew it, the man was storming back into the office, once again yelling at me for not being able to get into his room. Once I saw him coming, I quickly locked myself into the smaller back room. I knew he saw me go in there, but I was scared at this point. He started pounding on the door, demanding I let him in. He began pacing around the office and rambling like some type of lunatic. I couldn't make out much of what he was saying, but I did hear him say, "Kill her. Someone has to kill her." I had no idea who or what he was talking about. Being a guy myself, I at least figured he wasn't talking about me. He eventually began pounding on the door yet again. I told him I was on the phone and would be right out. I know at this point I should have called the police, but I don't want to resort to that on my first night working alone. It would also disrupt my boss, who was out of town on a trip. Through the door, I told the man that I would personally walk him into the room and try to get the door open, and if for some reason I couldn't, I would give him a different room. This seemed to calm him down a bit, and I finally felt comfortable enough to open the door. I took the key from the man and we started walking towards the room. I was leading the way, so the man was walking behind me. I kept turning around every few seconds as I didn't really trust this guy, and I was almost anticipating an attack. Once I got to his door, I noticed he was no longer behind me. He was several doors down at another room. He motioned to the door and asked me if I was going to try to unlock it. It was at that point that I had realized what the problem had been from the beginning. This guy, in whatever delusional state he was in, had been trying to get into the wrong room the entire time. This explains why both of the keys I gave didn't work in the first place. In the most polite way possible, I informed him that he was at the wrong room. He genuinely seemed confused, but when I opened the door to his room and motioned towards it, he finally figured out what was going on. I walked to the door and handed him the key. He went inside and shut the door. I hurried back to the office and didn't hear from that man again for the rest of the night. By the time I came back to work the next night, the man had checked out and I haven't ever seen him again. I worked at that motel for about 1 year in total. I had a lot of odd experiences over that year, but this one stands out as the most frightening. Number 2. About 10 years ago, I got a job working at a call center in an IT department. The IT department only consisted of about 8 of us, with most people working either in sales, management, or some other form of customer service. Our IT department was the only part of the business that offered customer support 24/7. I was the only female that worked in the IT department, so I tried to prove myself in any way that I could. Once I was done training, I had 2 options when it came to the night shift I would work. I could either work 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. 5 days a week, or 2 p.m. to midnight 4 days a week. I opted for the later shift as I decided working 10-hour shifts would be worth having 3 days off per week instead of 2. The latest anyone from any other department worked was 6 p.m., so from 6 p.m. to midnight I would be the only one in the building. This made me a little nervous, but the doors were locked at 6 p.m. and I felt pretty safe. By around 8 or 9 p.m. things would really slow down and I would get very few phone calls. We provided internet services for businesses, and the vast majority of our customers weren't even working by around that time. Some nights between 8 p.m. and midnight I would only get around 2 or 3 calls, so I always made sure I brought things to work with me to occupy my time. I would often go down to the basement to get a snack or drink from the vending machines. This was always that one thing that's made me very nervous. While in that section of the basement, there were a line of windows that looked out to the back of the building, which was nothing but forest. It always just gave me an uneasy feeling, but I would sometimes still go down there if I needed something bad enough. I was able to forward my work phone to my cell phone in the unlikely event I received a call during the several minutes I was away from my desk. Well, one night at work I was feeling extremely tired and was having a difficult time staying awake. I went down to the basement to get a soda from the vending machine. While walking past the windows, I thought I saw a figure of some sort quickly move out of my peripheral vision. Being that the area outside of those windows was forested, it wasn't unusual to see the deer or other animals, so I assumed that's all it was. I was retrieving my drink from the machine when I suddenly heard a large banging noise, as if something was thrown at one of the windows. This startled me, and I grabbed my drink and booked it upstairs. Once I was back to my desk, I was feeling extremely nervous but was trying to calm myself down. I figured that it could have been a bird that just flew into the window, or a number of things caused by an animal. I still couldn't help but to continue looking around at the different windows that were in view from my desk, but I saw nothing but darkness. Once I finally settled down, I heard noise coming from the area from where the front doors were. I looked over and saw a tall man with his hands cupped around his face, trying to see inside. I quickly dug down, but saw him made eye contact with me right before I was out of view. I could hear him pulling on the door handles trying to get in, but thankfully they were locked. He began violently pounding on the door and I decided to call the police. I dialed 911 and told the dispatcher my situation. Suddenly I heard a large crashing noise. I looked up and saw that the man was trying to break the glass of the door with a large rock. I dug down and told the dispatcher what was happening as I continued hearing the noise. I pleaded with them to get the police there as quickly as possible, and they were assuring me that they were. Until you're in a situation like that where every second counts, you don't really truly realize how long several minutes feels like while waiting on the police. The dispatcher told me to check the front door again, as the police were almost there, and they wanted me to let them know if the man had damaged the front door enough to gain entry, so that the police knew where to look for him at. I hesitantly looked up, and a large portion of the upper part of the glass was broken out, but it didn't appear possible for someone to climb through it. Seconds later, I began to hear sirens and eventually saw flashing lights. It was the best feeling I could ever possibly describe. With the police at the front door, I thanked the dispatcher and hung up the phone. I unlocked the door and began speaking with the police. Unfortunately, whoever that man was ran off before the police ever arrived. They suspected he heard the sirens and ran through the woods to get away. The owner of the business was called and we shut down operations for the rest of the night. There were a lot of theories as to who the man was or what his motives were for trying to get in there, but nothing was ever proven. I only worked for that company for about 1 more month before switching to a different company. Number 3. I work night shift from midnight to 8 a.m. I currently take the metro to and from work every night and morning. My job takes about 30 minutes to get to on the bus, but the metro station is only about a 5-minute walk from my apartment. My boyfriend was over at my apartment one night spending time with me before I had to head into work. We ended up losing track of time, and before I knew it, I had to run out the door to the bus station. We had gotten a lot of snow that night, so it would have taken longer for my boyfriend's car to warm me up and get cleaned off than it would have if I just walked to the metro station. I said goodbye to him. He headed to his car, and I started walking. Most of the area I have to walk in is pretty well lit, but there's one particular corner that is pretty dark at night. It is the corner that is diagonal from the metro station. Although I live in a pretty rough neighborhood, I've never had anything bad happen up to this point, so I was pretty comfortable walking alone at night. Since I was in a particular rush this night, I was paying even less attention to my surroundings, and I was only focused on getting to the station on time. As soon as I approached the dark corner across from my destination, I felt someone grab my arm. I didn't even see the individual coming. The man, who looked to be in his 40s, tried grabbing my other arm, but I elbowed him hard into the stomach before he was able to. It was really just a lucky reflex, and it caused the man to briefly let go of me. I took this opportunity to sprint away from him as quickly as possible. I got to the metro station and looked behind me as I was entering the door and saw that the man was still pursuing me. Once inside, I ran through the station and exited the other side of the building through a different door. I continued running until I made it all the way back to my apartment. Luckily, my boyfriend was still in the parking lot waiting for his car to warm up. I immediately got into his car and told him what happened. We then called the police and I made a report. I gave the officer the best description of the man that I could. My boyfriend drove me to work that night, but I still take the metro most nights that I work. I never heard back from the police, so I don't believe they ever found the man. But ever since this incident, I began carrying pepper spray whenever I walk to and from the station, and it stays in my hand until I'm done walking. Number 4. Years ago, I used to work as a stripper. By the time I had been doing it for about a year, I had a pretty decent routine worked out. I worked at a few different clubs in the area and would work both day and night shifts to maximize the amount of money I would make. From time to time, there would be the customer that would get extra clingy to one of the girls in particular. It was something that happened to all of us. Security was always present in case any of the customers acted out of line, but usually they didn't need to intervene. One of the nights I was working, a really rough-looking man came in. It seemed that he zoned in on me as soon as he saw me. This wasn't anything out of the ordinary, and I approached him, trying to take advantage of his interest in me. Shortly after, we went back to the VIP room and he received a private dance. He told me a little bit about himself and I gave him my fake backstory. He said he was a truck driver and was only in town 3 nights per month. I told him about the other clubs I worked at, and he seemed like he could become another good regular customer to have. Well, the next 2 nights he came to see me at each club I was at that night. Again, we would go into the VIP room. He began telling me that he wanted to save me from the life I was living and that I should move in with him. I know this sounds pretty creepy, and it is, but it's also not anything too out of the ordinary that I'll hear from customers. After the 3rd night of him coming to see me, I didn't see him for several weeks. He was apparently out of town for work, and I quickly forgot about the man. A few weeks after his first visit, he came back to the club. I acted happy to see him, but I was already beginning to get a little uneasy around him. Each time I saw him, he became more grabby than the time before, and became more persistent about me moving in with him. Finally, I ended up telling him that I wasn't even attracted to men, and in fact had a girlfriend, both of which were true, by the way. This didn't seem to change his aspect to the situation, and he continued to follow me around from club to club when he was in town. Finally, after a few months of this, I had enough of him. He came in one night and started his usual behavior. But when I turned down his request to move in with him once again, he became very aggressive and started to scare me. After that night, I tried having him banned from the clubs I was at, but it was somewhat difficult to have this done effectively. I tried switching up my shifts at the different clubs to avoid seeing the man, but he eventually tracked me down anyway. I was working one night at a club and was finishing up my routine on stage. That's when I noticed him walk in. As the song was ending, I tried rushing off the stage before he could see me, but it was too late. He came up to me acting very excited to see me. He again started with telling me I should leave with him, and of course I told him no. I said that my shift was ending and that I had to go get changed. I tried walking away from him and he literally picked me up over his shoulder and started carrying me to the door. I started screaming at him to put me down and tried signaling anyone I could to help me. Once we were only about 10 feet from the door, the security guard walked inside the door as he was just coming back from walking a girl to her car. He immediately pulled me down from the man and I ran backstage to get away from him. The security guard threw the man out and threatened to call the police on him if he ever came back. The man apparently told him that he was only joking around and wasn't actually trying to kidnap me. I waited backstage for over an hour before the security guard walked me to my car. I took the next few months off from working as I was too scared of running into that man again. I also told all of the clubs to tell the man that I quit if he called or showed up looking for me. Luckily, this seemed to work out and I never saw the man again. I worked as a stripper for another couple years before switching to a different line of work. Number 5. I worked the night shift at a hotel and have been doing so for about 5 years. Being a female, there have been quite a few times I've ended up in situations where I didn't feel entirely comfortable. But recently I had to deal with something that really stood out from the rest. Most of my nights are rather slow and uneventful, which is something I enjoy about my job. But this particular night was anything but boring. I was sitting at the desk in the front lobby when a man approached me. He just stared at me for a few seconds, so I asked him if I could help him. He began mumbling and the only thing I could make out was the word coffee. I pointed to our breakfast area, which was behind him, and told him that there was fresh coffee there. He asked me if we had coffee he could take back to his room. I told him he could pour a cup of coffee and bring it back to his room, or that I could give him a couple of packets of instant coffee instead. He asked for the packets, so I retrieved them for him. After handing them to him, he just kind of blankly stared at me for several more seconds before walking away. I thought that the encounter was a little odd, but just assumed the man was drunk or something. I went back to watching TV for a few minutes, until I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. It was the man again. This time he was standing outside of the lobby smoking a cigarette and just staring at me. It gave me a bad feeling, but there wasn't really anything I could do about it. When he was done smoking, he walked away. Again, I felt relieved and I figured I could finish out the rest of my shift in peace. Only a few more minutes went by before the man was back. He would walk down the hallway through the lobby, go outside, and repeat the entire thing all over again. After he did this about 4 or 5 times, he stopped in the lobby and started staring at me. I asked him if he needed any help with anything, but he just continued staring and didn't say anything. I was extremely uncomfortable and even thought about calling the police, but I wasn't sure what I could tell them. The man hadn't technically done anything wrong, he was just being creepy. He continued to just stare at me, so I just went back to watching TV and trying my best to ignore him. Finally, a woman that was probably in her 60s came walking into the lobby. I had never been so happy to see a guest in my life. It finally gave me someone else to talk to and just made me feel better not being alone with the weird guy. Before I could ask her what I could help her with, she started talking to the weird man. She told him that he woke her up and that she couldn't go back to sleep and therefore he needed to pack his belongings because they were leaving. It turns out that this woman was the mother of the strange man. He argued with her and told her that he didn't want to leave and that she should just go back to bed. I awkwardly sat there for the next minute or so while they went back and forth. Finally, the man stormed off to go pack his belongings. The woman then turned to me and apologized. She then explained to me that her son was schizophrenic. She was trying to get him help, but she's the only person he has. Apparently, he wasn't always willing to accept help, such as taking his medication. She told me that she noticed how agitated he was becoming and knew it was time for them to leave. We talked for a few more minutes until her son stormed back into the lobby. At this point, for whatever reason, he began taking his anger out on me. He started yelling all sorts of insults and other inappropriate things at me. Many of them didn't even make any sense. Finally, his mom was able to get him to calm down and got him to see what he was saying and doing. She then apologized to me for her son's weird behavior, but I told her it was okay. Although I was scared of the guy, I honestly felt bad for his mom. They then left after that last exchange. There's been a lot of weird things that have happened to me while working at the hotel, but that was the only time where I actually felt I might be in danger. Number 6. I currently work as a security guard. I am in my 30s and have worked in security for most of my adult life. Working in security for so long, I've seen some pretty crazy stuff. But one night recently I had an experience that was absolutely insane. I work overnight at a resort-style apartment complex. There's a total of 150 units in the building. Despite there being so many residents at any given time, there is only one security guard on shift overnight, as there's quite a few other security measures put in place. At 11 p.m., we lock all of the doors. Residents can leave but need to use one of the phones we have located around the property to call security and ask to be let in. We also have cameras throughout the property. On top of monitoring the security cameras, I'll also walk the property ever so often to make sure everything is secure and in order. If anything ever happens, I make a report, but usually things stay pretty quiet. We only carry a flashlight, pepper spray, and a cell phone to call 911 in case of an emergency, but our job is to mostly observe and report. We aren't supposed to get physical with anyone and can't detain people, but we're allowed to defend ourselves if we have to. Around 3 a.m. one night, I was getting ready to eat lunch. The phone rang at that point. I checked the caller ID and saw that it was coming from one of the phones we have set up on the property for guests to gain entrance to the property after 11 p.m. I answered and asked how I could help them. They didn't respond. All I could hear was them breathing. So once again, I asked them how I could help them. They started breathing even louder before letting out a loud maniacal laugh. I checked the security camera, but the individual was just out of view. The individual then said to me, "You're going to die tonight," and hung up the phone. A few seconds later, the phone rang again. The caller ID indicated that someone was calling from a different phone of ours. Before I could even say anything, the man told me again that he was going to kill me. I told him that I had already notified the police and that they were on their way. He told me the police wouldn't get here in time, and again hung up the phone. At the time, I hadn't called the police at that point, but I felt relatively safe in a locked office. I continued monitoring the security cameras and saw the man continually come in and out of frame. He disappeared for about 10 minutes and I figured he must have just been on drugs or something, and went back to eating my lunch. Suddenly I heard a loud bang on the window coming from the room next door. I went into the room and shined my flashlight out the window. It then revealed a very disheveled looking man. He was smiling at me and started telling me again that he was going to kill me. He brandished a butcher's knife from a bag that he was holding and motioned it across his throat, still smiling at me the whole time. He then rushed towards the window again and began smashing his head into it, seemingly trying to break in. I went back into the next room and locked the interior door and called the police. I heard the banging noises continue for about another 30 seconds until they finally stopped. I spotted the man on one of the security cameras a few moments later. I could see that he had blood running down his face from the injuries he gave himself. Based on where we're located, it took the police more than 10 minutes to arrive. They checked out the entire property but were unable to locate the man anywhere. I showed the officer the video that I had of the man and printed out a still frame of the best image I could find of his face. The officer said he would continue to patrol the area ever so often for the rest of the night to make sure all was well. After the officer left, I did my own check of the property and didn't see any sign of the man. Luckily, he never came back, and as far as I know, the police never located the man.
Number 7. I work for a clothing store in a large mall. I recently was promoted to assistant manager. After a couple weeks of training for my new role, I was closing the store by myself for the first time. We weren't staffed very well at the time, so it was just me and one associate. I walked up to the front of the store to put something away and noticed a man sitting outside of the store talking on his phone. There was nothing unusual about this, so I just smiled at him and went on my way. A few minutes later, I had my associate help me hang up a large banner advertising a sale we had going on. About an hour went by, and I again went towards the front of the store and saw the same man sitting out on a bench. He was still talking on his phone. He looked at me and began whispering, but I was able to overhear him anyway. I heard him say, "I can probably get 2, but at least 1. Here comes 1 now." At this point, I figured the man was referring to stealing merchandise, as we've had people grab items from our tables up front and run off lately. I decided to start folding clothing towards the front of the store so I could keep an eye on him. That's when he got my attention and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, can you come here for a moment? There's something I want to show you." I told him that I couldn't, as I was the manager on duty and wasn't allowed to leave the store. He asked me again anyway, and when I said no, he said he just wanted to show me how nice the banner looked that I had hung up. At this point, I knew for sure something weird was going on. I took a few steps back into the store to distance myself from the man. The man got up from the bench he was sitting on and followed me into the store. He began looking around at items as he continued talking to me. I looked for my coworker, but she must have been in the back of the store. Luckily, the store manager showed up to post the next week's schedule. She is older, larger, and overall more intimidating than I am. Once the man saw her and could tell she also worked there, he quickly exited the store. I took the opportunity to tell my manager the events that had just unfolded, and she became pretty concerned. She had to leave, but she said that she would notify security so they could keep an eye on things. Moments later, a security guard was walking by, so I stopped him and explained the situation to him as well. He told me that they had received other similar complaints lately of people trying to lure young girls out of stores they were either working at or shopping at. The security guard said he would keep checking on us to make sure we were okay and to notify them if anything else weird happened. At that moment, I spotted the weird man again and pointed him out to the security guard. The security guard went over and approached the man. A few minutes later, he came back and informed me that he told the man not to bother any employees or shoppers, but that he didn't really have just cause to contact the police. I haven't seen the weird man ever since, and thankfully, there haven't been any reports of young girls being abducted from the mall.
Number 8. I'm a female in my 20s and I work at a library on a large campus in my area. Generally, I am a very friendly and talkative person. One particular night at work, I ended up having a really bad headache. A coworker of mine named Steve came by to talk to me. I knew him pretty well, so I just honestly told him I didn't feel well and honestly wasn't up for talking. He said no problem and went back to work. There was a man that was standing behind Steve before he walked away, waiting to get my attention. I asked him if I could help him and he just kind of creepily stared at me, smiling for a few moments. Finally, he said he overheard me mention that I had a headache and asked me if I wanted him to get me a drink from the cafe. I politely declined as I thought it was kind of strange, and I knew better than to accept drinks from strangers anyway. It being pretty close to 9 p.m., he then offered to walk me to my car, as he knew the library was closing soon. Again, I politely declined. He continued standing around the desk I was at, and I started feeling very awkward. I turned my back to him and just started arranging things and doing some other busy work so I could avoid the weird tense situation. When I turned back around, I saw that the man had turned my computer monitor towards him and was looking through my Facebook page. I asked him what he was doing, and he said my first and last name and said he was very happy to meet me. Not only was I nervous about him having my full name, but I was also angry about the invasion of privacy. My voice was raised at this point, and I was asking him why he thought it was okay to go through my page like that. He tried claiming that it was on a public computer and therefore public property. Luckily, Steve was still nearby and he was able to hear me due to how loud I was being. He then came over right away and asked if everything was okay. I told him everything that just happened. Steve got in the man's face and told him he needed to forget my name, my face, and everything else he knows about me. The man tried to claim that he was just trying to make friends and didn't mean any harm. The man left at that point and Steve stayed in my area until our shift was over. I reported the incident the very next day to my boss, and security was notified and told to keep an eye out for the man, whose face was recorded on our surveillance system. I was told if the man came back and bothered me ever again, he would be banned from the property. But luckily, whether it be online or in person, I never heard from the man ever again. Thanks for watching everyone, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you have a personal scary story you'd like to share with me, be sure to send it over to southerncannibal@gmail.com. And before we bring this video to a close, I'd like to shout out all of my $5 or more patrons, as well as my $3 or more patrons featured on screen. Shout out to Yulisa, Babe Lincoln, Beth A., Kate E., Carrie B., Celeste S., Courtney T., LES, Howard R., Jacqueline W., Jazzy G., Jennifer M., Jess, Jonathan C., Catherine M., Carrie F., Matthew B., Michael G., Random Randy, Steph L., Tammy S., and Terry H. Thank all of you so much for supporting me on Patreon, and if any of you would like to join these awesome people and also become a patron, head over to my Patreon at patreon.com/southerncannibal. Thanks everyone, and have a good one. And remember to always